So if you have a problem, you may not want to say anything that's too offensive or abrasive because this will be recorded in history for quite some time. So why don't we just begin? I imagine that most of you have looked at the syllabus so far. I think that's kind of the more boring part of the first day, but we can at least run through what the expectations would be. Okay. So basically I'm just going to jump to the assessment piece of this. So each week, basically you need to send me 2 questions that derive from the readings. And I'm going to do my best to incorporate those questions in our class discussion. And it also kind of gives me a chance to see what people are thinking about prior to the course itself. So the questions need to go beyond simply recall of information. If I can just look at it in the article, then it really shouldn't be a question, right? So some kind of analysis or evaluation of the articles. So if you can send that to me by 8 p.m. the day before class, that would give me enough time to review the questions and organize them and so forth. Some of you have already sent me questions for this week. You're not required to do that for this week, primarily because I don't think it's fair for me to expect you to do that when we haven't really talked about the syllabus. So I appreciate those questions. I did go through them and organize them. And today, if we have some time, I think that we'll look at some of those questions. So there is a midterm in this course. And the midterm is not like a multiple choice test or anything like that. Basically, what you're going to do is to evaluate a petition against the use of automated scoring. So there is a real petition. Automated scoring is very controversial. So a lot of people do not like it. And I guess a group of people have actually made a petition that's been signed by, I don't remember how many people at this point, but a decent number of professionals basically. And in that petition they have certain points, and they then support those points with research. So you need to evaluate that, right? Do you agree with those points or not? Does the research really indicate that what they say it indicates? And then based upon your evaluation, you would then make recommendations as if you were to, say, state legislators who are considering whether or not to adopt this type of system. So I can go ahead. All of this is on the Canvas website. So let's look at this. So here you have the syllabus, all the readings. Here's the midterm itself. So this is basically just a description of what I said. The petition, and then research findings. Has anyone seen this before? No, well, good. And so far, no computer problems. I guess so. So a lot of the petitions come from, I don't know what this is about. I'm just going to get out of this. Okay. A lot of the people who find this really controversial tend to be English professors and English teachers. And they're the ones who's actually teaching writing. And they're the most kind of adamant about this being a negative thing. So basically you would kind of go through these are the main points. The other document contains supporting citations for those points. So this can be done as a group project. So if you want to work with 2 or 3 people, then you can do that. You don't have to do that, but if you want to do that, then you feel free to team up with 2 or 3 people, not more than 3 people. And basically you would turn in your evaluation and analysis of that. So are there any questions about that? Yeah.
We'll be looking through like what they're citing for research, but do you want us to look for other sources that either counter it?
I think that's a good idea
Okay.
to do,
Okay.
yeah. Now, I didn't have this as a midterm last time I taught this course. But I think that it was too large of a scope for people to do in a brief amount of time. And I had a different midterm, but I didn't like that midterm for various reasons. So hopefully this is much better. And it gives you at least a good chunk of the semester to be, to start thinking about this. So I would start on that soon, if I were you. So it's just... Okay, so what else do we have? The final project. Right, so you have a midterm, final project. Basically, you can do a lot of different things for the final project. So you can either pick, do some kind of critical review of a topic that's relevant to performance assessment. You could do some kind of analysis or evaluation of some kind of theoretical issue that's relevant to it, or create a teaching module. So for example, you may have seen the NCME, the National Council on Measurement and Education, they offer, some of the publications that they have is a short teaching module. There's a journal that's Practical Assessment Research and Evaluation Pair. They often have kind of teachy articles that summarize what's the best practices and so forth. So something like that would also be fine. This can be a group project. At the end, you would basically give a brief presentation on that topic, and then you would submit, the final paper would be like an article, basically an APA format. So I would highly encourage you to think about forming some groups and so forth. If you do want to join a group and for some reason you're having trouble finding a group, then I can help you. We can make sure that someone who wants to do it as a group actually has an opportunity to do that. The homework I've tried to keep pretty brief. So there are, let's see, in the schedule, a few, I think 4 different homework assignments, maybe 5. But they're meant to be kind of brief things. So the homework should not take you a large amount of time to complete. So for example, with your first homework assignment, you would basically look at some recent findings that have been discussed in the Chronicle of Higher Ed and some of these things about the multi-state collaborative, this initiative where they are doing performance assessments across 9 different states. They came out with their initial findings. So basically you just need to evaluate, look at that website, look at the results, and I have some questions for you to respond to. So that they shouldn't be extremely challenging or like it's going to take hours outside of class to finish those things. We'll also do a job analysis, at least a short version of a job analysis. Last year, or the last time I taught this course, that also, we originally were doing that as a homework assignment, and it turned into this huge ordeal. A lot of controversies about, so basically that in that situation we were wanting to think about the skills and the competencies that are necessary to be successful as your first year as a GA. And then we would basically make a specification table using data from this job analysis. So we sent out a survey, a questionnaire basically, but defining those skills became extremely controversial, and it took way more time than what I thought. Now we're not going to do that, and you are just given some data that has already been collected, and then you basically just need to create a specification table from it, which shouldn't be that hard once we run through how to do that. What else? Mesic versus Moss. I don't know if many of you are familiar with Pamela Moss and her work, but we will go through that, and they have very different views about validity and so forth that, that conversation is really kind of taken place in the context of performance assessment. What else? I think we'll do a rubric. Basically, in that assignment, I'm just wanting you to pick a rubric you think is good, a rubric you don't think is very good, and then answer a few questions about why you think this rubric is better than the other rubric. You would bring that to class, and basically we would talk about some of your findings. So that shouldn't be too bad either. We will have one brief exercise on rater agreement and G-theory, so you'll get some data. Basically, I'm going to show you how to run it in 2 different types of programs, and then I just want you to interpret the results, basically. So you just need to tell me what these different things mean. And the whole purpose of that, I know that we offer a class in classical test theory and G-theory, so we don't really have time to go into all of that as if you would, at least in depth, the depth that you would for an entire semester, but you at least, I can't really teach this class and not mention G-theory, right? It just doesn't make sense to do that. So the other thing that I want to do, the other reason I want to at least spend some time doing this, is there's a program that's a free program that you can download, and that program is way user-friendly compared to Genova. Genova is I don't even know when they updated it, but it's basically a DOS. The interface is all DOS-based, which I think when computers first kind of came out, people were doing DOS things, but that doesn't really happen anymore. And plus, it's very touchy. This program is very easy to use, and it can do most of the things that Genova can do. There are some limitations with it that you can't do using this program, but I've never personally encountered a situation where I say, oh, I can't use this program. And if I can get the data and the output very quick without dealing with Genova, then that's what I'm going to do. So you'll at least have some experience with this program. And mainly I just want you to get comfortable where you can at least run an analysis in it and then interpret basic output from it. Okay, and that's pretty much it aside from the final project. Do we have any questions so far? So it shouldn't be bad, I hope. All right, so for this week, you were assigned 3 different readings. No more than that, 4 or 5, maybe. 6. But they are short readings, right? There's only 1 or 2 that's kind of long. And I think many of these are old, but I think it's important to think about this from a historical perspective. What types of conversations, what did that really look like when performance assessment was being, touted as this kind of cure-all for the ills of testing, right? And I think the reason I had you read the Lindquist article is because in 1951, right, he doesn't come out and start talking about performance assessments, but he's also talking about some of the very same things and how he conceptualizes tests that these people are debating in the 90s and stuff. So I think it's interesting to see it from that kind of historical vantage point. So why don't we continue with and actually get into some things. It only took 15 minutes, which wasn't bad. I'm just going to start off with maybe some questions about performance assessment. our interest in performance assessment. Why do we have a class in it? How am I interested in it? I think that if you look at this in terms of policy, which I think you got a decent overview looking at the battle between Wiggins and Cizik, right? You can see politics of this, right? And this is still happening today. There's still this tendency for people to think that performance assessments will be the answer to all of the problems with standardized tests. And I think there's misconceptions about standardization. So there's a lot of things happening there, right? Can we do this in a way that meets the same standards that we have for other tests, right? Are they somehow different? Should we treat them as being special? Do they need their own validity framework, their own language, and so forth? We'll get into a lot of that stuff because a lot of people say that they should. It should have that. I don't personally agree with that, but whatever. My main interest in this really pertains to a problem of task specificity, right? The main problem that we see with respect to performance assessments is the fact that students or people are inconsistent across multiple tasks that are theoretically designed to tap into the same skills, knowledge, whatever. That's a problem, right? And I think that's a huge problem. So in other words, if I think that, so basically what that amounts to is there's a task by person interaction. So what students I think are doing good may radically depend upon the task that they're given. So if I use task 1, I may come to very different conclusions than using a different task. And as far as I can tell, people don't know how to handle that situation. So I think it's interesting. And I think that people have to address that in some way if it's ever going to realize its promise, right? So without us kind of going into a lot of detail, do you have why are you, or why might you be interested in performance assessment? I know most of this is a required course, right? So many of you are here because you have to be. But why might something like this even be required?
I think in certain situations for assessment, like arts and humanities, for example, it's more appropriate, so it's really good to have it in our toolkit.
So it might be more appropriate in certain situations. Why would the arts and humanities, why would it be more appropriate there than in some other discipline? And I'm not saying I agree with that, but why might it be more appropriate?
Difficult to write multiple choice questions about music.
Mm-hmm. It might be. And if I am writing multiple choice questions, then I may be tapping into very different types of skills. Or if I do want to use multiple choice questions, I may have to be very creative in how I structure those so that I am tapping into those skills, right? And we may not be that creative, I think, is one of the dangers with it. So today we're going to discuss semantics because it's very challenging when you're reading the literature. People are very sloppy in how they talk and think about these things. So I think clarifying some semantic issues, a brief history, and then we're going to get into the Cizik and Wiggins debate. So what is performance assessment? You're now experts. So what is it? It's okay. I mean, that's a complicated question. To have even conjectures of what it might be, or even what would be an essential feature of it. So something that it must have that would separate it from other things. So without that, it may not be considered performance assessment.
So I think generally performance assessment assessment is a way to evaluate either a process or a product.
That's very good. And I think that's the main distinction that you see within the literature, is that you see it, which we're going to talk about that, but you see a distinction between processes, right, and products. Now, there are occasions in which that distinction is kind of gray. And I think in those situations, who cares, right, if it's a process or what you call it in those gray situations. I wouldn't get too wrapped up in it. But in a broad sense, you can make a distinction between processes and products. And in some cases, it's kind of blurry. So what would be an example of a process as opposed to a product that we might want to assess or include as a part of our assessment?
If you're talking about writing, revisions.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Writing is not writing is a process. Now, you end up with a product, but how you get to that product is oftentimes very labor-intensive. People might use different strategies for creating outlines and so forth and revising. So what does that process look like? And that might be important if we're concerned about the process as opposed to just the final product. So what experience, do any of you have experiences with performance assessment now? Such as?
A little bit. So I teach in communication studies, and so we do a lot of performance assessment in the classroom of assessing speeches. Also participate in the debate community for a decade plus, where every weekend people compete orally, and you're evaluating decision-making processes, oral communication.
Well, I would be interested to see how you evaluate my oral communication for this presentation.
Sure turns out.
Yeah. Well, you shook your head like you've had some experience with.
Yeah, so I guess as we're working with different programs to try to help them use assessment to actually improve student learning, performance assessment is becoming an increasingly more important part of that. And I guess so far we've worked with a group of faculty from the School of Communication Studies thinking about persuasion and how to help students better analyze, kind of dissect and modify and improve persuasive messages. So we're going to work on this semester actually helping them try to build some sort of performance assessment for that. And then last semester we worked with a group from the computer information systems, and they needed a performance assessment rubric to help students do something called requirement solicitation skills. So they have to engage in interviews with their clients that they then build these systems for. So it could be a system for like paying your employees, or a system for if you work at a dog kennel, like keeping track of all the dogs and who their owners are and whatever it is.
Did they present at a staff meeting here? Yeah, I remember that.
Let them create a rubric for that, and then a class assignment, because we're trying to help them see assessment, particularly performance assessment, as also a pedagogical tool, not just a means of measurement.
Now, that's one of the arguments that people have advanced in favor of performance assessments, is that it will change pedagogy or instruction or how we go about teaching students. Now, whether that is true is an empirical question, right? There should be evidence of that, if in fact that's the case or not, which we'll evaluate some of those arguments as well. So what about authentic and alternative assessment? What are those things? As people use it in the literature, or as what might even be your ideas about what this be?
Is authentic assessment using like coursework also as like a type of, like you would assess a homework or?
It could be, but it could be a lot of different. Like, how would authentic assessment be? What makes it authentic versus something that's, not authentic?
It better approximates real
So we have a criterion situation that's similar to what's the article that you talked about, or the Lindquist article, right? There's some valued criterion that I want to, basically the more that my assessment aligns with that criterion behavior, the more so-called authentic it is, right? So to give like a simple example, if I'm doing some job placement test and I need someone to type, I don't know, letters or whatever, then I may give them a typing test of the types of letters that they would typically be expected to write. I need some way to evaluate that, assess that. But that would be more aligned than maybe asking some multiple choice questions about the mechanics of typing, right? Now those are very simple examples. But I guess a way to think about authenticity is alignment with criterion situations. So what do we want to predict, or what do we want the test to indicate? Right? What about alternative? What's alternative? Because these languages are always in the literature. Yeah, what were you saying?
Standard test, not standard test.
Yeah, so oftentimes people will use this language to reflect, at least it's my interpretation of the literature, that it reflects anything other than multiple choice tests, just about, right? That's an alternative. What were you about to say?
The same thing, but I actually have a question too. So I was wondering this as I was reading, and I think it applies here now. So a lot of times when people talk about standardized tests, what they actually mean are multiple choice tests.
I know.
So can performance assessments also be standardized, or is it that they're completely?
I hope that they are.
Okay.
And I think that's a really good point, though, because that's one of the misconceptions that I've noticed in the literature. There are tons of people who talk about standardized tests and as far as I can tell, what they mean is a multiple choice test. So, and you see this in news articles all the time. You see it by educators all the time. They talk like this. You even see it in some of the articles that you will read. For next week, you'll see these misconceptions in the literature by people who are well known in their area. So that's a concern, I think, because there has been this kind of political attack on standardization, but is that really a bad thing? And can we get authenticity and still have some degree of standardization that allows us to make comparisons, that allows us to get the type of information that we want to make, right? Or, I mean, allows us to make the types of inferences that we want to make. Okay. So, let's take a look at some things that might be considered good and bad definitions. So I actually printed this off, just in case you didn't print it off. And some of this is just kind of food for thought, but I think that given the fact that we oops. Let's see how big this will make it. Some of this is just kind of like, I don't know why it's doing that. Oh, that's not too good. Maybe that's why. Some of this is food for thought, right? So I think just kind of interesting things, but you should think about, I think if you're defining a construct or you're defining whatever, you need to think about, well, what is a good definition? What's a bad definition, right? What would that look like? Because some definitions are bad. Some definitions might be better. And what criteria do we use to evaluate definitions? So this is just kind of food for thought, but as a preliminary type of thing, I think it's interesting to think about the importance of semantics and the importance of definitions. So one way, and people disagree with me on some of this stuff, but language has a dual function, right? One thing that language function, like one benefit of language, is that it allows me to kind of give meaning to my experiences. So if you think about a baby, before they have language, they have experiences, right? But they cannot structure those experiences and give meaning to them in the way that we can. So I may have an image in my mind or something like that, or some feeling, right? But I can't really interpret that feeling in the way that we can through language. It's through language that we give meaning to those things. Does that make sense? Now, some people don't agree with that, and that's fine. Now, but if that's true, then what's the second? Not only can language kind of illuminate experience, but at the same time, it constrains my experiences. Right? So here's some kind of examples of this. In English, right, we have multiple words for different flying objects. In Hopi, there are 2 words, one being for a bird and another word for every other kind of flying object. Now, if I'm speaking Hopi, and how I structure my experience of that is very different than the way I may structure it if I speak English, right? Arabic, tons of words for different distinctions in camels. I know we've all heard the same thing with Eskimo, right? There's tons of words for different types of snow. I don't really think of the experience of snow, to me, is probably very different because I don't experience it very much, and when I do, I don't really need all these ways of describing it. Now, think about this, right? If I lack the concept for something, right? So if I simply don't have in my linguistic kind of repertoire a word for a concept, how doesn't that constrain the meaning that I give to that when I experience that concept? So, for example, there might be certain concepts about love, about whatever in relationships. And when I'm thinking about the problems in my relationship, I structure it using my language, right? So in some sense, it structures things. So I guess my point to this is that it's important. How we use language is really important. To strive for clarity, strive for precision with the way that we talk about things. Now, obviously, there's various value-laden features of language, sometimes that we don't often recognize. And that's kind of an interesting tidbit as well, right? At one point in the history of this country, the titles that we would use for women would always convey their marital status. There wasn't a way to talk about women without somehow letting me know if she's a single woman or a married woman, right? And when people made a proposal to, let's use this miss over here as this kind of generic thing, people were upset about it, and a lot of the people would say, it looks silly. That's why we shouldn't use it, right? But in some ways, language can lead to bias, right? Especially when we're talking about tests and items and so forth. And sometimes they can be biased in ways that we would never expect it to be. I think Wiggins tries to point out some examples of that when he talks about the farm animal item, right? That the students got this item wrong because basically down the road a giraffe was on a farm, and they thought, well, of course it's a farm animal. It's the main attraction at this farm, right? So sometimes very subtle, this can kind of creep in very subtle ways. It's very hard to predict beforehand. Okay. I'm not going to go into all this stuff, but basically when we think about how we're going to define something, typically we want, at least with certain types of definitions, we want our language to pick out the essential features of that, right? So we're kind of thinking about how it fits into a class and what distinguishes this class of objects from other types of objects, right? That's ideally what we would like to do, and we don't always do that. So what makes something good? Well, we need the essential features or essential characteristics of it. Sometimes I've seen people use circular definitions So, for example, when I try to define student effort, I say, well, it's the extent to which they gave effort on the test, which seems obviously problematic because I'm using effort to define effort, which doesn't make, it's not very helpful to me as a reader. So avoid things like that. Don't use figurative language, which hopefully all of this would be somewhat intuitive, right? We shouldn't use similes or metaphors or those types of things if we want to be precise with our language or description of it. And don't use the negative, right? So if you're just telling me what something is not, you need to say something in the affirmative. So when we think about these definitions for alternative assessment, authentic assessment, and so forth, I personally don't like the word authentic assessment because of its value implications, right? Now, it communicates when we talk about, which I didn't really talk about this, but connotation, there are some subjective, it communicates some kind of moods, these feelings and so forth about, wow, if it's authentic, it must in some way be good, and everything that falls outside of that is in somehow deficient or inappropriate or whatever, right? So there are certain value connotations that's just with the word authentic assessment. It sounds kind of cool, right? How could authentic assessment be misled or harmful to people, right? And it must be valid, right? Because it's authentic. Of course it's valid, whatever that means. Do you have any thoughts or questions about that? These are other things just to kind of keep in mind. You know, oftentimes people use language, so like euphemisms, for example, a polite way of saying something that's, you know, so I didn't cheat on my wife, I had an affair. It's nicer, doesn't sound as bad. Killing innocent people in war, that's just collateral damage. Right, we can use language to structure things in a way that is oftentimes a bit misleading about the reality of it. There's also a distinction oftentimes if we're using vague terms and meaningless terms. So if a term is vague, then at least in theory, we should be able to clarify that by expanding on it in some way. It's just vague. We can clarify it, you just haven't clarified it when you're using the term. So did I give an example of that? Yeah, tall, that's vague. I don't know what you mean by tall. Now you can clarify the term by telling me something about tall, right? In the context in which you're using it. Meaningless terms cannot be clarified. And you often see this in media. Sometimes you see it in the literature and so forth. But a meaningless term, like Billy Bob's Bar is the best in town. Well, what does that mean? That's meaningless, right? I suppose you could operationalize best in town in some way as an effort to clarify that. But what does that mean? You know, America's the greatest country on. What does that mean to be the greatest? We need to have information about that for that to be meaningful, right? Like what criteria are we using for that? Trying to think of another one, because in these cases you can at least ask for additional information, right? Setting aside the subjective connotations of it and say, oh, we're not going to worry about that.
For meaningless terms?
Yeah.
Like freedom or rigor?
Yeah, freedom, rigor. They sound, oftentimes you'll see people, and the reason I bring some of this stuff up is because authentic assessment is one of those terms that's, you know, but what is freedom? We're all about freedom, but what is freedom? You know, I don't know, but it makes me feel good when I think about it, right? But you could take a whole class on the nature of justice and free, you know, like what are those things? Those are very difficult things to define, and people debate that stuff, right? So it's not like this certain thing about what it means to be free is quite controversial.
today in our PAC meeting for creating criteria to evaluate faculty, they were trying to propose the difference between satisfactory teaching and excellent teaching is that excellent teaching is intellectually rigorous. And so that's what I was thinking of, meaningless terms, or trying to differentiate between, you know, what is rigorous and what is not rigorous. And then also the connotation is then that's, you know, if you're satisfactory, that means you're not intellectually rigorous.
Right. I don't know what that would mean. How you would differentiate that isn't clear to me.
That's what I suggested.
Yeah, we were having, I don't know who I was talking to, but this came up in some other conversation, which I can't remember the example, so I'll have to move on from it. This came up recently about terms not, like I don't know what you're talking about when you say certain
Is it
things.
the rubric for OSER?
Maybe. Yeah, that maybe that was it. So even when we create a rubric, and we're training people to use that rubric, the terms that we need, the more it indicates some kind of behavior that I can see, it's less, I mean, it's more easy for people to rate that and agree about it. If you are still using kind of complex terms, that's fine to do, but you really have to go through more extensive training so that we know what I mean by certain things, right? So it's not like you can't do it, but the training's just more complicated. Yeah. Yeah, so those are just some thoughts about authenticity. So the question then becomes, because people often use authentic assessment and they won't mean multiple choice, right? So even though they don't come out and say that, you can tell by how they write and what they're kind of implying and so forth that multiple choice can't be authentic. So my question to you is, can they be authentic? And if so, give me an example of that. Can multiple choice tests be authentic?
I'm thinking of there's a GitHub, like how to use a GitHub account training, that you have to do a task and then you get the right answer, but you have to do the task first to be able to get the correct answer, and then you choose from like the multiple choice options.
I'm not familiar with that.
Basically, it's just
training, but-
server commands, and then like whether or not you do it correctly, it'll give you back the correct answer, and you can choose the correct option. Which would be authentic, because you're still doing what you would have to, like, for the skills that you need.
Yeah. So, and I think that's one of the things to kind of point out is the connection between my assessment and what I'm asking students to do and my criterion situation. If that's how I'm defining, so any assessment that has that characteristic, or maybe it's not even a dichotomy, but the extent to which it does have that characteristic is authentic, then multiple choice tests would be authentic in any situation in which whatever I'm doing is aligned with the criterion situation, right?
I guess I've heard some
And-
people describe
yeah.
it in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, and some people think that not every multiple choice test, but a lot of multiple choice tests are sometimes easier to use to get at some of the lower level things, like, do I know, maybe like, can I identify some sort of content knowledge about statistics or communication or whatever? And then if you want me to actually synthesize or apply or evaluate, perhaps it will be more difficult to demonstrate that in a multiple choice question.
Yeah, I think, I do think oftentimes that's how people, it is easy if you're designing a multiple choice test to think, well, can they recognize, can they recall, or use those types of action verbs to describe what's happening in a multiple choice test. But there are situations in which people can be very creative with how they structure those questions. And we'll talk about this some later because Mesick points out how this can happen. Where we can get at cognitively more complex skills with enough kind of creativity in how we structure those things. But I think Mesick does kind of a very nice job of walking through how that might look. But it's very difficult to design those types of assessments. Okay, any other thoughts before I move on? I don't know what time it is, 2:40. So we got time. I'm always worried about the time. All right. It's kind of weird teaching in this room. What do you think?
Yeah.
Just seems kind of odd. Like the board's not really accessible. It's just kind of odd.
For this many people.
Uh-huh.
If there were 3 of us.
If you watch earlier, I
Yeah.
would write something. We could just.
Yeah.
Huh?
We just interpret whatever you want and draw things for you.
Okay. That will be your performance assessment. Okay. So we've already talked about authentic versus alternative and so forth. Typically, performance assessments capture both of those things. So when we look at the definition of, now people, I should need to clarify what I'm saying here, right? Because you gave a definition about looking at processes and products with respect to performance assessments. Now, in the literature, people will often use authentic assessment as interchangeable with performance assessments, but performance assessments are not by definition authentic, right? So just because we're doing performance assessment of some kind doesn't make it magically authentic, right? Because we're still using that. So the question then becomes, which I should put a page number there, right? Is authentic to what? Right? I need some clear indication of my criterion situation. And I need to specify that. So one of the points, I guess, is that I want to emphasize is that when you're writing about this, if you ever write about this, then you need to define your terms and let people know what you mean by certain things, right? And that doesn't happen as clear. Okay, so I'm going to skip past that because we've already touched on those things. So here are 2 different definitions that's a bit more broad. At least the first one's a bit more broad for performance assessment. So a sequence of responses aimed at modifying or changing this environment. Changing the environment in some kind of specified, like there's some boundaries with what you're expected to do. But we're manipulating the environment in some way. Do we like that definition? No?
I don't know what it means to modify the environment.
That's my question as well. What does it mean to modify the environment?
Anything?
Well, that's what kind of makes it a good definition, is because the performance is the behavior that modifies a given environment.
Performances would have to modify the environment in
So
some
if
way.
it's a speech, or if it's you're a chef and you're doing something, it's like, here are these ingredients, modify this environment to make it into a pizza.
Mhm. Do I modify the environment when I select a multiple choice answer?
Something changed, I guess.
So you could get kind of, like
Yeah.
everything I do modifies the environment on some level, I suppose, right? The second definition is more aligned with what we were originally kind of talking about. You're still modifying the environment and so forth, but you see the distinction between process and product.
What do these seem like definitions for performance, though? Like, where does the assessment part come in these definitions?
I'm not sure if I understand what you're...
Like, if we, performance assessment, 2 words, like there's the performance, and then we use a rubric to assess it.
Yeah. Well, we haven't talked about assessing it
Okay.
yet. Yeah.
This just seems like it's only about the performance part.
That's true. Yeah. That is true.
And the second one, maybe the closest you get is demonstrates knowledge, but nothing in the first one.
Where does the assessment fit in this? That is kind of a separate, it's almost treated as a separate issue. Okay, so if I'm going to make a presentation, and here's what I'm going to do, right? The presentation itself is a performance of some kind. Is it a process or a product? Yeah, but it seems to me to be both, right? So that's kind of an example where that distinction isn't very clear to me. If I'm going to, I think here's some other examples. If I write a paper, process or product, what do you think? Huh?
Or could be, depends on how many times you like read it or.
Well, I think if I'm looking at the end, people treat it as kind of a product that I've made, right? If I'm looking at like the strategies I use to make it, then it's right. It's more of a process, right?
So does the evaluation criteria determine whether it's a process or a product?
So, what would be some examples of evaluation criteria that might
Well,
influence how I think about it?
Yeah, so if basically someone is turning in a paper that you are then going to rate the final product, then it's a product. But if maybe they turn in multiple iterations and the evaluation rubric really focuses on the process and the iterations that they go through, then it's
Yeah.
more a process evaluation.
Yeah, I think how I would design the rubric and like what I would look for would be very different.
Right.
Yeah, and one of the problems is that multiple processes lead to the same product in some way, right? So if I just look at the product, that product is realized potentially through very different processes within a person. And then trying to tease apart what processes lead to this product, I mean, that's a very challenging thing to do. Even what processes lead to me giving a response to a multiple choice test, very difficult to get at that information. But it's important information, according to some people. If I execute an experiment, right, now maybe the process would be how I execute the experiment if I'm looking at the procedures I use, but then I may write some lab report or I look at the end of that. And then singing is another kind of weird one, right, where it's hard to know, is that a process, is it a product? And I think in those situations, who cares, right? It doesn't really matter in those situations. So given some of this, and given some of the definitions that we've looked at, what would fall outside of performance assessment? Is there anything that is actually outside of this umbrella? Yeah, some people have pointed out that, look, even my response, right, is some kind of performance. So I think that most of the time when people use performance assessment, they don't mean multiple choice tests, even though technically speaking, I am kind of modifying the environment. It might be a product, right? Is there anything, though, aside from multiple choice tests that people might question as whether or not it falls, what else aside from multiple choice tests might fall potentially outside of it?
Just
Or at least
matching
it's not
kind of
as...
multiple choice? Or
So maybe matching
fill in the blank.
items. Well, fill in the blank's kind of gray in some ways. Am I asking for the extended paragraphs? Well, that's kind of a product and so, do I just fill in one word that's fill in the blank? So in some sense, some of this stuff becomes very gray, right? And I wouldn't get, most of the time though, I guess, people do not mean multiple choice tests is one of the things. And they typically refer to some kind of, like something that's very difficult to, or more difficult to score and so forth, right? Where we need a rubric or something along those lines. So the boundaries and the use of language is kind of muddled, I think, when you start reading articles, which bothers me because it's not as clear as what it could be. Okay, so all of these things, right, kind of fall underneath this umbrella. Oral examinations, if I have to demonstrate something. anything that would be an end. So if I guess a written paper, what else might be an end product? If I have to make, like let's say I'm in some welding class and I need to make a bead that's straight and has certain kind of character, that's a product of some kind.
Like sticking someone with a needle, like an IV or...
Yes, doing things like that would be a performance of some kind. Someone may in theory know how, I should do it, but what I say and what I do might be very different things. Okay. And sometimes we need to actually see someone do something to infer that they can in fact do this. So would you want a brain surgeon, for example, who has never actually operated on a person, but they could recite all the definitions and causes of different illnesses, different things in the brain, but I may be able to do that, and for whatever reason I can't actually perform, and that could be dangerous, right?
That was interesting. I remember which one it was in, but one of the news was talking about pilots and how when they had the person with them that was testing them, they were more likely to pass because they got more money if they were passing more pilots. So in that case, the test was actually more appropriate as far as if you look at validity for pilots that do well following the test of whether or not they can do what they're supposed to.
Now how would I know? Let's use that as a
Yeah.
fun kind of example, right? So let's say a pilot, because that's a good example of a performance, or a driving exam of some kind. You have a written test and an actual driving test, unless they've changed it. So someone will usually ride with you, but you have to pass the written test and you have to do certain things. So even though I can tell you how to parallel park, can I actually do it, right? Now, let's say that for whatever reason, the people who, I guess the people who are motivated to pass you whenever you're driving because they get more money, or I don't know, right? Is that an issue with how would we kind of treat that? It still doesn't, I would not feel comfortable strictly relying upon the written test. I would think we need to change the structure of our reporting system so that people are not motivated to do it. Because and let's say that we do just rely on the written test, right? How can I assess whether that's going to be good or not? By how many people crash when they don't have the, you know what I mean? How do I know that that's better, that that's just as good as the flying test? Well, I need the flying test and maybe correlate those things or use performance on that to predict that. But if that's not good, how can I even determine that? Unless it's just looking at the consequences of shifting to a different system. So do you know how they decided that the written test was just as...
I don't think they went into it too much, but it seemed like it was one of those necessary but not sufficient sort of things, where it's the time with the pilot, it wasn't enough to make sure that they do everything they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that's another thing with multiple choice tests. There's numerous situations where I have to have content knowledge probably to perform something. If I don't know anything about the driving laws, then could I reasonably be expected to drive according to something that I don't know anything about, right? So in some sense, content knowledge or recall even, or recognition might be important as a necessary but not sufficient condition to successfully perform something. Okay, other thoughts, questions? Tell me if we get to a point where we need a break. So basically that's just another way of pointing out processes and products and so forth. Okay. Another thing that you see within the literature quite a bit, which is also value-laden, is people often refer to standardized multiple choice tests as objective tests. So an objective test. What is an objective test?
A is the only right answer, and the right answer will always be A.
Okay, so when we look at the definition, right? As objective, I just pulled off of Google, something like that. Something that's not influenced by personal feelings or opinions, let's say. Now, typically we refer to scoring procedures. Multiple choice tests, once we have the key, right, to it, are objective in the sense that people shouldn't disagree, right? Like if they do, I mean, they may disagree about it, but it's not because they have different subjective interpretations of an A or a B. It might be because they're tired or something along those lines, or they misread the key or something. And we have machines now that can score these things. Now, they can make mistakes, obviously, but for the most part, we know what the right answer is, right? So in that sense, it becomes more objective. Things that performance assessment, the scoring procedures are more, they're not as objective. And part of the rubric development process is trying to translate that into something that is more objective, so to speak, that people agree on that. So basically, my take is the use of literature, they tend to emphasize objectivity as a scoring, when scoring and agreement isn't really an issue. Now, does this apply to performance assessments? And think about automated scoring. Is that objective now? Because I tell you what, if you give the same algorithms to two different computers, I bet you they agree perfectly about how to score a paper. There's no such thing as inter-computer agreement if they are given the same program, right? That's a non-issue with automated scoring. It is an issue with humans. So even that distinction becomes a little blurry. Part of the reason is because oftentimes now we still use humans as kind of the ultimate criterion to evaluate computers. All right. Everything that we are going to talk about is on some level controversial, right? You can't really teach this course and not get into controversies about some of these things. But this you'll find in your textbook that you have for the course. They have a depiction of something that's similar to this, and there's another reference that I think they actually used when they decided this. So when people are talking about some of the advantages and disadvantages of performance assessments as opposed to multiple choice tests, you usually see something kind of like this, right? So at the far end, we have true-false questions, multiple choice, short answer, essay, some project, and then a simulation of some kind. And this is not a simulation that we usually run, but it's more aligned with the criterion situation. So for example, if I'm a pilot, then I can put them in a simulator, have them land a plane, and so forth. And I may want to do that before they're up there flying with me. You know, I don't know how that would work, but simulations are often, I think they're also becoming more popular. So for example, at ETS, or the Educational Testing Service, there's kind of a movement towards more performance-based things. That's if you look at game-based assessments, right? So students can play a game where I've seen some of these games where there are science tests of some kind. They're given a problem, they have to collect evidence, evaluate that evidence, and start going, you know, form some tentative conclusions and so forth, but it leads them through some kind of real life problem where a town might have some pollution issue or something like that, right? And that might be more kind of realistic to how people practice science than simply asking a series of, you know, what is it, you know, the multiple choice questions. So those are really neat, I think, if you can combine them with the computer skills. I think the hard part is they're very expensive to do, and you really need a team of people that can design it and who can provide more of the psychometric, like how do we analyze that stuff is another huge topic. How do we do that? So the degree of realism is one thing that usually distinguishes how people try to distinguish performance assessments. The complexity of the task, right? So me in a simulation doing this type of task where I'm doing multiple things, I might use multiple, I may pursue that task very differently than the person next to me. That's more complex than me simply filling out a bubble in a Scantron without doing things like that. The time is one of the criticisms of performance assessments. They take an extremely long time to not only develop, but then how do we implement that and score it? That's probably one of the main reasons why you don't see it on a larger scale than what it already is. The resources needed is huge, and then like what we already talked about, the judgment and scoring. Requires more judgment and scoring, with the exception of automated scoring. Okay, questions? Today is mainly semantics and all of those things. So strengths and limitations, here's another. Like I said, all of this is kind of controversial in some ways.
Is it controversial that these are the strengths and weaknesses, or which of these strengths and weaknesses determine a given instrument in a given situation?
Well, like let's say that, like look at one of the strengths listed here is number 4, right, where we say a strength would be the increase in cognitive complexity that the assessment kind of requires. Well, that's kind of assuming that we can't accomplish the same thing using a multiple choice test, right? Realism, if we think about the alignment between criterion situations, I may, if I'm really interested in content and recall, maybe because I do think it's necessary to do something more complex, well, that's, if I'm really interested in that, does that become my criterion situation in some ways, right? Or can I structure those tasks that is more aligned with that? So I think that you can use multiple choice tests and get at some degree of realism and so forth. So I guess like most of it, this is how people typically think of the strengths and weaknesses. But I think if you're creative enough, you can challenge some of these things, or at least show that there are exceptions to some of these strengths and limitations. Usually, I think one of the main benefits that you see people with multiple choice tests, kind of, many advocates who say, well, we can cover, one of the main benefits is it doesn't take that much time for the student to do, and we can cover this wide breadth of information, right? So in terms of the types of things, the breadth of coverage is a lot easier to accomplish a wide breadth of coverage with multiple choice tests. If I have students write a paper, my breadth, so let's say they're given an assignment where they have to, evaluate or analyze what led to World War I or something like that, right? They're writing a paper about that. Well, that's one thing, right? That's one observation. And it's very difficult with that type of thing to get a wide range of samples, basically. Most of the time, we're stuck with 1 or 2 samples. And the extent to which that would generalize to performance beyond is an empirical question, but that's, it's questionable whether that does. And a lot of the people who've done research in that area suggest that maybe it doesn't, which is a concern. So even though you have complexity in a task, if that doesn't generalize to these other situations, why do we care? It might be different if it's a music performance, or we might be more willing to say things like that. But writing is one situation where it tends to be task specific. Or there's features of the assignment that seem to matter. Some people criticize multiple choice tests and standardized testing because it reinforces this idea that there's one correct answer, right? Do we really teach students, is that realistic, right? That do many of the problems of our world, in our world, have one correct answer, right? So for climate change, is there one correct solution to that, right? There's one way to resolve that. Or there may be multiple ways, like how do you, is that kind of realistic and with the skills that the students need?
I was gonna say, I think it goes hand in hand with the factual knowledge. If it is a factual piece of knowledge, then yeah, there probably is one correct answer.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm teaching math, right, and a student tells me that 2 + 2 is not 4, and that's open for debate, some things are not open for debate, right? So for example, the reason why you might take more multiple choice tests in 605 is because some things are not debatable. If you're thinking about Levine's test, right, well, I'm sorry, but if you're interpreting that as an effect size or something, I don't care. It's open for debate, right? Some things are agreed upon knowledge. We agree about this. It's not something that's controversial, really, right? So in some cases, there is one correct answer. And the more that you kind of deviate from that, you're more likely to mess things up. And that's one of the things I tried to teach people in the 606 course is they would start to give these creative answers. And the more creative they became, the more wrong that it became. Now, it's helpful to help kind of pinpoint where misconceptions are, but I think oftentimes people feel like they can expand on something, and the more that they expand, it's helpful. Well, it can be, but you have to be careful with your language and how you say things and talk about things, especially when we're dealing with technical information, right? Okay, any other thoughts about this?
I feel like it's kind of your job as an educator to, it's not like one or the other, like you just have to figure out which content best lends itself to multiple choice and which you need something else for. So, I don't know, I guess that's just kind of your responsibility. So you don't have to be on one side or the other.
So when we talk about the Wiggins and the Cizik debate, you might get this sense that there's a dichotomy where I have to choose this way or that way, or like there's some, I must use multiple choice tests, or I must just do performance assessment, and if I do, I have to abandon this idea of multiple choice tests. And that's not the case, obviously, right? And I think when we look at some of that, we'll get into this. Okay. I went to the doctor a while back, and the nurse who was giving me, like taking my blood pressure, she'll read your vital signs or whatever, she'll take your pulse and those different types of things. So she's taking my blood pressure, and I said, what's the difference between systolic and diastolic blood pressure? And I could tell that she started to become a bit embarrassed because she didn't know the answer to it, right? So I tried to kind of alleviate her embarrassment and say, oh, it's okay, I'll just Google it, or right? Yes. Yeah. So the people that know me know I'm not a counselor of any kind. Yeah. Well, what do you say in that situation to? I mean, she probably feels like she should know that, but it's not every day that you're asked that question. And to be honest, that's a situation where you can successfully perform the task without really knowing what you're doing, right? So there you have a distinction where I don't need content knowledge to write down the numbers, and I'll let someone else interpret that, or I may even know what's good and what's bad, but I really don't kind of understand why that's good or bad. I just know if you're above this or below that, there might be some concern.
Sort of, right? If that's the only task of the nurse. But if the task of the nurse is also to make your patient feel comfortable and welcome and like they're in the hands of someone good, then they're failing if they don't, if they can't answer a fundamental question or say, address it in some, in some situation.
Yeah.
But they should probably know that.
I would assume so.
Yeah.
So. I wasn't trying to trick her or anything, like I just couldn't. I didn't know the answer to it, and I thought, oh, well, what's the difference between that? And anyways, I wasn't trying to embarrass her. Now, there might be certain, like you said, skills that are needed in nursing where if I can't answer basic questions, it will make maybe client or people wonder, who are these? I don't feel very safe in this hospital where the nurses don't know anything, right? So I guess that there's a distinction, like I said, between what we say and what we do, and there may be even times where I can complete a task, and I may do that well, but I don't have content knowledge. So I can just run through the procedures, but I don't really know what I'm doing. Maybe another example of that is if I might be able to run a factor analysis using point and click options, but I don't really know what I'm doing, right? I don't know much else about it. So sometimes advancements in technology lead to those types of problems. Okay. Nurses do make a difference there. Yeah, so for example, I just pulled that from some video game or something like that, right? So I guess okay, so let's take ethical reasoning that has been a concern here at JMU for quite some time, right? And right now we have some assessments of their content knowledge or whether they can use these things even in some way in a story and so forth, right? Now, what might be interesting to do is to take people who score high on those and put them in a secret situation where they're faced with some ethical dilemma and observe how they behave, right? So I might leave a wallet out with some money in it. They don't know that they're being observed, right? And of course you'd have to get this past the IRB and so forth, but it would be interesting to see, do people that score higher actually, and that can think about it in this more complex way, does it influence their behavior and decisions when they're actually confronted with this situation? And we can assess that more or less directly, right? So I think one of the assessment tools that we use now asks them to think about, isn't that right? Where they have to think about a situation and write about how they handled it. But, it would be, and that's kind of a less realism that's lower on that scale than seeing what they actually do when they're confronted with something, right? Because social desirability, other things might kind of play a part in how I choose to frame it. Now with this situation, I was thinking more of like a battle scene, right? Where there might be certain skills that I have in terms of using a bow and arrow or using different weapons, let's say. And when you look at some of the early performance assessments, that's kind of what, military is a performance. Oftentimes in basic training, you're confronted with a series of performance assessments, okay? And I might know in theory how to do some of these things, but doing it is quite different. I may know everything about how a weapon would work, but I can't shoot it accurately, right? I may be able to shoot it accurately and not know that much about those things. So there are times where those things matter. So we'll check the time one more time. Do we need a break? Let's take a break. Okay. Oh, I need to turn off my recording thing. So you also read an article, I'm not sure how to pronounce the first name, but you read an article that was a brief introduction to the history of performance assessment. And they indicate, I need to find the page numbers to that as well, that they want to provide a historical perspective to help arm people against surrendering to the panaceas peddled by too many myth makers. And then they go on to talk about the historical development of performance assessment, going back from, say BCE to 1990 or so. How does their basically communication of history accomplish this aim? Does it? What does it mean to arm people against surrender? Like, what is that? What do you think that? What do you think that they mean by that statement? And then the next question would be, do they accomplish it once we understand its meaning?
I think they were trying to be erroneous.
Huh?
I don't think it makes sense.
So it doesn't make sense.
Well, I think they're taking that position of this isn't going to be the solution to standardized multiple choice questions.
Mm.
Or, or there are people who are saying that and they don't believe them.
They are the myth makers, let's say, right? The people who are advocating for performance assessments might view it as a cure-all to the problems that people or concerns that people have about testing. And this would be our way out of it. And I guess the myth makers would be them. They're advancing it for as this cure-all. And they're giving a historical perspective to counter this notion that performance assessments will somehow cure all of the problems that we have with testing. Do they accomplish that? Do they give me reason to think that, performance assessment isn't a cure-all?
Well, I guess their main argument was it's not new, it's happened in the past, it's been used in the past. So if that's the case, then it's not going to do anything different now as opposed to what it was doing before. I don't know that that does provide the evidence, but I think that's their argument, part of their argument anyway.
So what was it doing before? Why did we move from what primarily happened in, say, China and even Europe basically before we had the development of multiple choice item, I don't think was developed until probably the 20th century probably at some point.
1914.
Was it 1914?
That's what it says.
Yeah. All right. So 1914. So what were some of the, what led to, why did we start shifting to multiple choice tests that are standardized, right? Why did we do that? Was it not in an effort to maybe fix or deal with some of the problems of performance assessment? Maybe.
A large number of people at once. They needed it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the large scale multiple choice stuff that we see now comes out of the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests that they use to test incoming soldiers so that they could place them in
Right.
positions.
But
Yeah.
they were also trying to get rid of some of that subjectivity.
Okay, so subjectivity is an issue, right, with scoring, that if we have people, say in the 1500s, who are taking an oral examination for their dissertation defense or something, right, and the people who are listening to it can't agree about whether this person passes the exam or not, well, that's a problem, right? And we maybe need more effective ways of dealing with that problem because they didn't have rubrics back then, I suppose. So that's one issue, might be subjectivity and scoring. Another issue might be its ability, can we really use this on a large scale? And if so, how do we do it? It's more efficient to use multiple choice tests that don't take that much time, and the scoring is pretty much straightforward. So when you look at some of the things that they've mentioned about this movement toward multiple choice tests due to increases in efficiency, it's very easy to administer as opposed to some kind of oral defense or something like that. Standardization, everyone will receive the same items, right? For the most part, or very similar items. Objectivity and scoring, and it's cheap compared to performance assessments. So one of the challenges with performance assessments even now would be, can we administer this on a large scale? And if so, how? I think many people hope that advancements in automated scoring will be a way to accomplish something like that. And there's reactions to that, right? Even if we don't have automated scoring, let's say that we don't have that, can we do it efficiently? Can we give it to a large number of people and reasonably score these things? And I think we could, but it would cost a decent chunk of money to do it. And is it worth it? Right? Even if we did do it and dedicate the resources, is it worth it? So those are some of the problems that we are still facing. So let's look at these two people. Now, the pictures are kind of old, but that's one of the pictures I could find. So I guess I don't want to be attacked by someone for using the wrong pictures or outdated pictures. So here we have two people who you read, they're back and forth with each other about that occurred in the early 90s and so forth. So before we kind of get started on that, what are your initial thoughts about their conversation? Do you see yourself as kind of siding with one more than the other? Do you think that I'd just like to know your initial thoughts about the articles.
I think I found myself kind of agreeing more with Wiggins as I was reading. It seemed like he was taking a more like a holistic approach, and that it's about, can we make good judgments based on all of the knowledge we have, not just do we have this knowledge, but what can we do with that? I don't know, I felt myself agreeing more with him, but I can also see the points though that Silik is making.
One of the things about their dialogue is that you can see how emotional and this becomes, right? Where they're kind of attacking each other, not always based upon evidence and so forth, but making kind of, comments about each other and whether they should do this or that at their job. And, I mean, it's just, so you can see that people really care about this, right? And that people are not always nice about it. So could you imagine then these two, during this point in time, maybe things have changed about their relationship, I really don't know, but if they met each other at a conference, or let's say one was giving a presentation, what types of questions you might get from the other person. Right? So being prepared, I think, to deal with those situations is necessary, because some of the more important things you might do might be the most controversial things that you do.
Did they have a good relationship? Because it seems like the tone was very bombastic, almost in a hyperbolic way, so it was almost more playful than sort of, like, in part to kind of drum up the debate and drum up the interest in these things.
That could be.
Because I find it hard to believe that this would be published if they were seriously going so aggressively after another. Now, I've seen these kind of debates happen where people do go after one another, but not with the kind of tone here if it's a very serious, not that this isn't serious, but this seems very...
That's an interesting take on it, and I don't know what their actual relationship is like or was like at that point in time. And I know that, I guess when I first read this and then reread it and so forth, I have a tendency to view it as not very playful, right? I don't know how many other people might view it that way, but they're still kind of taking a chance of it being misinterpreted by a lot of people, even if it is kind of playful, as these two kind of fighting each other in some ways.
Well, like
I don't know,
they
but the
generally
playful nature of
disagree.
it might be.
But it's not a sort of an antagonistic, like if they're at a conference, they're not going to avoid one another or really
No.
hate one another, but more like you have probably colleagues in your program or colleagues in your department who you like, but you fundamentally disagree on some important thing, like this language thing that you were talking about earlier. There might be people in cars that just disagree, but if you were to play this out in a public scholarly way, you would be like this line, methinks that Gregory Isaac doesn't
Yes.
protest disingenuously.
Yeah.
That made me chuckle. Like that.
Yeah.
It's like open the piece with that. It's like, okay, this is kind of more playful than it is.
Mhm.
And at points, I actually think it distracts from the real arguments. Like there aren't very good arguments being had back and forth. A lot of it's just this rhetorical in a negative way, kind of gesturing.
Yes.
Because on the whole, like, I really think they want the same things. Like, I think they actually, I mean, I don't know if they're just like trying to get noticed or annoy people, but I think they, at the heart of it, really want the same things. Like, like, let's think about validity questions. Like, let's make sure that the rigor that we apply to standardized and multiple choice tests is also there for performance assessment. And like, we can't think of performance assessment as this like unicorn of a thing. Like, I think they both want that. They're just being mean to each other. I don't know. It's weird.
I think I agree with you. I think there's been a couple times where I've been reading back and forth articles where I think they're taking it to extremes on purpose to make their point to the readers, and not because they're actually taking those extreme points. You said that you felt like you were agreeing more with Sizek, or Wiggins, or whichever one. When I was reading the last one by Sizek, the 91 October, he actually says that they both have unique benefits. I was like, oh, okay. Well, your first one said that you hated it. And the second one, you didn't. So I could see how that they might have been just kind of pushing to the extremes.
Yeah, in Sizek's part two, his last two sentences are like, yeah, performance assessments, it's useful. It's just not, like you were saying, like the replacement. And don't treat it as a
Don't act like it's a
replacement.
cure.
I don't think Wiggins was acting like that in his
Yeah.
writing, at least. Maybe he did some other time, I don't know.
And that's kind of, in order to get published, people who just agree with one another aren't going to get published.
Well, that's not very interesting,
Right.
is it? Yeah. So we do see these opposing views, and I think there are questions about how much of it is, like when I actually would read through these and think, what's the argument being made? And as opposed to just saying things, right, without really supporting it with an argument or with data or something, right? There's a lot of kind of saying things. And when you start to look at, well, what's the real support of this? I start to, in some ways, think that they're kind of speaking past each other rather than to each other. Very similar to what I see with political debates. There's not a real debate in the sense that they're talking about points. They just each have talking points that's not really addressing some of the, yeah.
I was just kidding, sorry, Matt.
Well, what were you
I was
saying?
like, what?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know how shocking that might be. But that's kind of sad, I think, that it doesn't really facilitate a real conversation. So sometimes they would talk about what the other person said and so forth, but sometimes I don't know, I had the impression that maybe they were speaking past each other in many ways. So let's look at some of the things that they were saying. Or this is really me paraphrasing. Right? So I'm not quoting them, but these are things that they would say. So tests should be based on actual challenges and habits needed for success in the real world. True tests of intellectual ability requires performance of exemplary tasks. Thoughts? So maybe we can go back to the first one. Tests should be based on actual challenges and habits needed for success in the real world. Who disagrees with that statement? Does anyone say that no, tests shouldn't be based on actual challenges and habits needed for success in the real world? They should just be based on things that's, useless, I suppose, for the real world. Does anyone disagree with that statement?
I guess it depends on the purpose of the test.
Well, expand on that.
So maybe if you're just like, I don't know, if you're just taking an intelligence test, or if you just get, I don't know, if you're just given just to assess your intelligence, what is that doing for, like, applying to college, you just take the SAT. Is that success in the real world? Is that...
Well, that might be one of the criticisms that people have about the SAT or ACT is that we're looking at these skills, say, you're maybe given some word that you've never seen before, and now you need to pick an antonym or whatever. Now, am I going to encounter that in the real world? Well, if I did, I could Google it, right, and find out what is an antonym and so forth. Now, with respect to the performance assessment, we have writing task with the GRE, let's say. Does that reflect writing that occurs in the classroom? And when you look at the correlation between writing performance in the classroom, they're not that big. I don't remember the exact values, but you'll read some articles eventually that will talk about some of that stuff. So it doesn't predict performance in, does that reflect writing really in the way that I would write an article? Am I going to be given some prompt that I've never seen before, and now I've got this amount of time to structure some argument about it?
But is it better than nothing?
I don't know. That's an empirical question, and it depends upon what we want to accomplish with it, right? If we're using it to make admission decisions, then hopefully it reflects something about what they would do when they're here. And we would need to investigate that as a validity issue.
That is a good point, though, because when we teach students how to write, we're never like, you should sit down and write this paper in 40 minutes, and then you're done.
I think many people who are teaching English and writing courses, they say that's not how you should write, right? So if anyone did that, do you think that you would publish something that you just sit down and start writing it, right? And you're going to submit it and everything's fine, right? I mean, it's a process. It's a long process usually of revising and restructuring things and so forth. That's real writing.
Maybe it's not actually getting at writing.
Or the real process of writing, yeah.
Maybe that's getting at some other just reasoning skill or, perseverance or something else that is more predictor of success in college or graduate school than, let's say, writing. I'm sure they're claiming writing is the thing that they're using, but...
Well, actually, it's analytic. Yeah,
Mm.
so it's not even...
Yeah.
So in which case, that might be true, yeah. Analytical thinking happens in situations like that. You ask a question in class, respond. You read something, respond. In a job, you're faced with a query or a problem, respond. It's not like you have...
That's true.
4 weeks to draft, revise.
Right.
Wouldn't that be more of like an interview screening type of activity then, rather than a college admission or graduate school admission then?
I think a large part might, we need to really have a clearly defined view of what the criterion is. We're getting at something, hopefully, Otherwise, we're wasting their time. So it's designed to get at something, and does that predict things that I care about or not? And if it does, to what extent? How well does it really accomplish those things? And I'm not sure. I know that many people in the English world, when they view it, that's the criticism of the writing piece, is that it doesn't predict, like, why are we doing this? And if the test developers are saying, well, we don't want it to, it's not meant to assess writing, right? It's meant to do something else, then we need to then get some evidence to say, hey, this is working or it's not, or revise it if it isn't, so that it does actually accomplish what we want it to. So very few people. Now, the intelligence test is another interesting, like, why do we take intelligence tests? Why were intelligence tests even developed?
Developed to,
You should know this,
Yeah.
because you're a school psychologist.
Well, they were originally developed to place people into different levels of education.
To predict performance in school, and to place people, who need extra help or whatever, so that we can identify people that are not going to be successful in school. Now, that's the reason that they were originally developed. How do we use those tests now?
Primarily, we use them to identify students for special education.
Okay, so for special education, does a student need to be placed into a special program or not? And I'm sure that that's not the only test that we use, but that's maybe helpful in determining whether maybe further testing needs to be done or whatever. Now, I guess the question would be, does it accomplish that purpose or not, is another empirical question, because people with scores below a certain value or whatever these cut scores might be, well, when you look at their behavior in class, they shouldn't be failing the course, or I mean, they should be having difficulties in the classroom if that's how we're using the test. But we need evidence to say that if that's how we're using the test, right? Now, does that align with the real world situation or not? Well, I guess, to the extent that the tasks on that test are similar to the tasks that they use in the classroom, or maybe the skills are similar, right? But that alignment would be critical in determining that, right? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I haven't looked at the validity evidence for that. True test of intellectual ability requires performance of exemplary tasks. So a true test, let's say, of intellectual ability, whatever that is, requires performance of exemplary tasks.
I agree, depending on how you define those things, but kind of what Kristen said earlier, if you define intellectual ability as to know something, then the performance, the exemplary task for that would be to identify it, to recognize it. And then as you go higher up on Bloom's, or depending on your cognitive model, the task should match the intellectual skill or ability required from it. And good tests will do that. True tests would do that. I don't know if that's what that's saying, though.
Yeah, so I guess what we mean by exemplary depends upon how we're kind of defining that situation. So if we're defining it in terms of content, like recall, that's exemplary in some situations, but other situations it's not exemplary. I don't know. I don't know. I don't have answers to all of these things. There's things to think about. Well, I guess when I think about exemplary, I think of the very best thing I could do, right? So if you want to assess writing, and you're looking at a product, it's a paper, then I need to give you the very best paper that I've ever done before. Now, is that, I think if I take that interpretation, I tend to disagree with what he's saying here. And it's not clear to me how you should interpret this, right? I don't know. All right, let's look at... So we should recognize that schools teach what is tested. So we start looking at the positive effects of aligning instruction with real-world, say, tasks. This is systemic validity. which, as far as I can tell, is an indication of the tests are basically evaluated by their benefit to education. So a lot of the people who've been critical of multiple choice tests says that the damage is done in pedagogy, right? That teachers are then teaching to the test, and if my test assesses skills, it's just recalling information, then we're going to memorize things so that you can recall that information, right? And that's damaging in some way. Performance assessments, many people who advocate for its use make the opposite, or basically say, hey, if we start doing these types of things, people will start teaching to these types of things, and that's what we want them to teach. Things that's needed in the real world and so forth.
Maybe. But right now, there are good teachers that teach the real world things, and those teachers their students also get good grades on the standardized tests, if the tests are aligned to the real world things.
I think, I mean, in some ways I think, like, because in some ways what we have and the fact that teachers do take to the tests really signifies that we have a flaw in our education system, not that there's necessarily a problem with the test.
Mm-hmm. On some level, that goes back to the point that someone mentioned, I think Paul mentioned it, about how the test is used, right? So there may not be a problem with the test per se, but when we use the test to punish people or to not fund certain schools, then it's that use of the test that might be concerning, and that's why people are teaching, like if that's the only thing you're looking at and you place that much emphasis on it, it may have consequences that's undesirable on some level, right? Now, would that magically change if we go over to performance assessments? And that's one of the things that Seisig mentions, is that these are not necessarily going to change. So will performance assessment be more fair? Will we have bias? Like one of the criticisms with multiple choice tests, there's bias with the items and so forth. Well, performance assessments, will they be biased? Will that be fair for everybody to do? Will it be more fair in some way?
I think it's more about the process than the assessment itself. So like, if everything had to be all performance assessments, I think the value in that is that, like if it's coming from the faculty that are creating, like, I guess the assessment people would be taking a backseat in this way, because like if it's the faculty who are really like unpacking what these learning outcomes mean, like I want students to be good at analyzing, modifying, and improving a persuasive message. Like what the heck does that even mean? And me, with my colleagues, had to agree and like maybe see what other people in the discipline think, and like if we can unpack that to an extent that we can get it on some sort of rubric or assessment tool, and then like agree on how that tool could be used, and then think about like what specific pedagogical practices or activities or class demonstrations or class assignments will help students get all of these things that we just unpacked and put on this rubric. Like to me that would be better, but that's about a process. It's not the instrument itself. Like that's a part of the process that's necessary, but that's not by itself. Like if we just made this rubric and left it on the professor, like left it in their mailboxes, and we were like, okay, be a better teacher, help students learn better, like that's never gonna work.
Yeah.
It's like, I think it's just like if it can be part of a process, or like the other things that it can bring up is what will actually matter, not the assessment itself.
Yeah, and that's I think that's kind of his point here in some way, is that the structure of the assessment itself may not have these consequences that we're hoping that it would. It's a bigger problem than that, right? You have to look at incentives, and I don't know if he actually says that or not. It's been a while since I've looked at some of those. Can it be better by any rigorous standard? Well, do we need new standards or new ways of evaluating these types of assessments? Would the traditional or ways of thinking about measurement error, validity, do these apply to performance assessments or not, right? And surprisingly, I mean, there are some people that believe we do need something different. And he's basically saying it doesn't make sense to change those things. And if it, we need to have the same kind of quality, expect the same quality of that as we would any other assessment. So, you don't ever talk about these psychometric standards, and you rarely discuss this, what I mentioned before about task specificity, never mentioned, right? The fact that we have one observation that may not generalize to these other conditions, right? And all this talk about authenticity is face validity. Now, what do we mean by face validity? Does it look that way? Does it look authentic or not? And some people, I think they've quoted where they actually say things like, this is the, whether it looks this way, that's really all we care about. If we all agree that this is authentic and this is what it's doing, well, that should be the end of the conversation. There are dangers with that view, obviously, right? Does face validity... Now, you won't read about this anymore in measurement, like the standards. I don't think it talks about face validity. But this is still a term you might see in some textbook somewhere. Does it matter? Does face validity matter? And they have this conversation about whether, in fact, it matters or not. And what's the argument in favor of face validity?
Investment and like buy-in from people. So you mentioned school boards and everyone being able to kind of buy into the process.
Right, and I think that's probably something most people would agree about, is that if the test looks crazy and weird, and this people taking that test can't see some connection, it might inadvertently impact motivation. It might inadvertently result in these consequences that would be problematic when you're trying to interpret these these scores, right? Do you think that this is a fair assessment of Wiggins? Like, does he primarily seem concerned about face validity with respect to authenticity? Yeah, so for example, when we're talking about authentic assessments, and Wiggins is talking about these things, does that, is he really talking about face validity? Is authenticity just another way of describing face validity?
I think it's face validity until he actually has more to back it up. Because otherwise it just seems like it would be a good idea. Because if he doesn't have data to actually back up what he's saying yet, then I think his points about whether or not it actually has, whether the tasks are good indicators across people, and those are big issues.
The other thing I think he's concerned about too is that should not be the new, what's the, I can't remember the language that's used in the article now, but that's not that's right, the new deity, right? So if we're looking at a deity to worship in psychometrics, right, it shouldn't be face validity. And that is a danger maybe. Okay.
It's where he has a line there responding to the face validity stuff, where he kind of conflates and that with use and consequences. The aim is not the semblance of realism, so I take that to mean face validity, but the educative and motivational power that comes from tests built out of exemplary and vital challenges and from the model performances from which we learn and are inspired. This idea that the power comes in the learning, the process by which these things are created, used, and even performed.
Yeah, I think one thing we found with the ethical reasoning stuff, a lot of faculty say that rating students writing about ethical reasoning helps them get ideas and think about better ways to teach it in their classroom. So that could be just another example of how, like, the rubric itself or the prompt is not doing any of that. It's them engaging in the process of reading a lot of student essays, rating a lot of student essays, becoming very familiar with the rubric and how we're defining ethical reasoning. And some faculty have commented that that's helped them pedagogically. So maybe that's kind of an example of what he was trying to get at in terms of being in the process.
Yeah. So I would suggest that you keep those things in the back of your mind when you're reading the readings next week. Because next week you're going to read a NILOA occasional paper that's basically you have one person advocating for standardized, specifically the CLA, which is a critical thinking test, advocating that challenges, basically there are these red herrings, and he lists 7 of them and argues against those things. And then you have a few people reacting to it. So it's an interesting paper if you haven't read it so far. But I would keep that, as you're reading it, that idea in mind to see what you think about that conversation and the criticisms that are raised. Would that somehow fix those things? I think the point with inter-rater reliability is fine. I do think we have processes that we can, we've learned a lot about that type of thing, training and so forth. But that's not the only thing that we need to be worried about. And that goes back to the task specificity issue. Yeah, we've already talked about that enough, I think. Okay, so here. Are you wearing rose-colored glasses? Which I have to go through and put a hyphen there. So it's almost as though I think there's this impression that it will be this kind of cure-all, and that if we shift over to performance assessments, everything will somehow be better. So you're saying, hey, people are still going to teach to the test with performance assessments, right? Now, I guess the debate would be, are these tests worth teaching to, right? Maybe some tests are worth teaching to. And ideally, if you have a decent assessment, it might be worth teaching to that assessment. Yeah, we've already talked about the task. Face validity may be high, but other forms of validity are threatened with performance assessments. Same thing. Must be the same standards as other tests. We don't need to change these standards. So he's basically saying, hey, multiple choice items, one of the things that he criticizes is that they're simplified and decontextualized, right? So we're kind of stripping away the context of whatever criterion situation that we're interested in when we use multiple choice tests. So for example, I think some people have done research where they've actually went to some country in South America, this remote village, and they were testing children in their math skills. And basically they would give them some problems. These children would work, I don't know, selling things or whatever. And so they met with them and they would give them maybe some basic math problems that use the same types of skills that they were using when they doing some exchange for goods or something, right? So addition, subtraction, and so forth. So they found that when they gave these decontextualized answers where a problem that wasn't put in context, they tend to perform worse than when you framed it in a situation that they encountered in their day-to-day life, right? One of the things about standardization as well that I didn't put here is that we do assume that common knowledge is important, right? We assume that there must be some common knowledge with students in a culture that doesn't necessarily value, or that values more kind of individualistic types of things. And that creates some political controversies and so forth, right? So why don't we give many children in K through 12 education have what's referred to as an, I think it's like an IPE or something like that, like an individual placement, IEP, individual education plan. Yeah, so IEP, individual education plan. So they get an education plan that's really tailored to their needs, their, you know, skills and so forth. Well, why don't we do that with all the children? Shouldn't they all have an IEP, right? Maybe in theory that would be really nice to have every child has their own IEP, but with our current, that's not doable or feasible unless you're willing to hire a lot more teachers and take that amount of time. So, I mean, what would assessment look like if we completely abandoned standardization? What would it look like? I don't expect you to have answers to that now, but I would think about that as well as you're reading the articles for next week. How would we accomplish that? What's the purpose of testing, even? And can we accomplish that purpose without standardization? But then you need to think about, how do we define standardization? What is standardized test and what would an unstandardized test look like? And so forth. Okay. Most of the readings that you have talk about some ultimate criterion behavior, right? Even that 51 Lindquist article talks about this alignment and categorizes tests according to their alignment or the relationship between a task and some criterion. I don't see that as a bad way of conceptualizing or thinking about tests, really, right? What are we ultimately interested in? And design assessments that align with that. And maybe we can work backwards. I don't see that as controversial. I think someone mentions rose-colored glasses in the article. I don't remember who it is, but that's why we have rose-colored glasses on. Huh?
I think it's the other dude talking about him.
Okay.
With
Sizing.
performance assessment, they have rose-colored
Yeah.
glasses.
Okay, so we need to, I think, we're almost done. What do you think he means by this? Because this is something that Wiggins does mention, right? Multiple choice tests tend to sacrifice validity in the name of reliability. How might that happen? Can that happen?
Guessing, maybe? Like having all of them, like all the options available. Like it's not a true measure of whether or not they know it because it's only, like how it's constructed may be the most valid measure of that construct.
So guessing,
Yeah.
you can't, if I ask you to write an essay about what you did this past summer or something like that, guessing is not the same type of problem, but we can model guessing, right? It's not as though, with some of our models we can try to account for guessing, right?
I think too, maybe multiple choice has like more items, so reliability is better than just one essay. It's just like one instance, but the validity of multiple choice isn't as accurate, I guess. It's not as accurate of a representation of the construct.
I mean, like mathematically, we could probably devise some sort of series of questions that correlate and allow us to consistently rank order people. But that particular set of questions might have nothing to do with the thing that we're actually trying to say they have something to do with. Like in theory, I could ask you a bunch of questions related to maybe like taking care of your pets. I don't know. Like we could make questions that relate to each other and allow us to rank order people in terms of their pet taking care of abilities. But if I was told to write a test about like, I don't know, like your knowledge of like maybe like some sort of veterinary skills, like how well you could perform like a vet surgery, I don't know. I mean, if I'm trying to say that like it's lacking the validity evidence for that. But in theory, like we could make up any questions that mathematically could give some sort of a good reliability estimate.
So guessing is not an issue in those situations, which can influence reliability, right? So I didn't want to say that guessing is not like an issue. And then we're getting into the breadth of content covered and what that content would actually reflect, right? So someone's not going to guess in surgery how to do it, right? I mean, they might, I suppose, but, right? Guessing is a different type of thing, I guess, when you're looking at many of the performance assessments. And then if you're looking at the type of information that we collect, right, is it possible for me to randomly select items and obtain high reliability? And the answer, I think, is yes, it is, right? I can randomly get a set of items that you will consistently respond to, right?
His statement to me though seems like he's like saying there's something inherent about multiple choice items that sacrifices validity, which is why I was thinking it had to be something about like the nature or like the functioning of the items. Like in, so say for example with multiple choice items and there's some construct or relevant variance going on with like where you can take educated guesses, in which case it's not getting at the construct, it's kind of like conflated with, because of how it's worded and you recognize it and it's familiar, then you're more likely to do better, which is a less valid measure than the actual construct.
See, yeah.
Yeah, go. What were you?
I think that you're on to something there, because I think it's something,
It seems inherent to me.
it's something about the objective nature of what they're looking
Yeah.
for. Reliability is easy to calculate. It's objectively something that you can mathematically run and get very quickly, whereas validity is usually something that you have to make a case for through evidence that you collect in some way, right? You have to build an argument for why there's validity. That's a lot more difficult and sacrificed when you're worshiping at the the deity of objectivity.
Now, with going back to with what Scott was saying, and I think Kristen was implying as well, is that you can get, like, one of the situations where people get concerned about reliability, how do we increase it, right? What, according to classical test theory, or typically, what a lot of people use, well, the number of items that have at least similar characteristics, assuming that, right? But we can increase the number of items to obtain high reliability. And people might, it's very easy to increase the number of items on a multiple choice test. And here with the performance assessments, it's harder to get a broader sample of that, but he might say that that doesn't necessarily matter as much. And my initial thoughts might be because of authenticity, right? Can we have validity without how we choose to think about reliability? And that's one of the things that we'll get into with Moss and some of her positions, is because that's kind of a question. Can we do that? And I think if you're going to say something, Kelly.
I was just saying, this reminded me a lot, and what I thought that they were talking about was what we talked about a lot in research methods, for those who are in it and remember this lively discussion of internal validity versus external validity, and that's what I thought he was talking about.
Can you elaborate on that?
In terms of like internal validity, which I think we ended up agreeing what that meant was like psychometrically, statistically valid, versus external, which is like authentic, or what we've been saying is authentic, like is actually closer to what reality is.
One way that I tend to think about those things with respect to, with respect to internal validity and external validity, when we're talking about experimental design, is different than how we talk about it in the measurement world, right? We don't think of, it's a different way of thinking about validity, right? So with experimental design, you're mainly interested in, can I infer something about a causal effect, right? Now, the extent to which that effect generalizes across people, across settings, across whatever, is a generalization, right? So even though I can find evidence to support an effect, that effect may only exist in certain conditions, and I need to investigate those conditions, right? Now, in the measurement world, when we are talking about like external, I think I don't want to confuse this too much, but let's say that I'm making inferences about scores on a test. to what extent are those inferences or that use of a test supported across different conditions, settings, and so forth, right? There may be situations in which it works well with one population or under certain conditions, and I find that for some reason that tends to fade off once I find this new situation. So maybe I can use it in this context, but when I shift that context to something else, it doesn't make sense anymore, right?
So, question.
Yeah.
Internal validity in that case then would be like, some of the assumptions about like the measurement properties, maybe like local independence, or whether there's differential interaction, like that kind of stuff is more the internal control over those things, where extrapolating or generalizing it would be the other. Is that
I don't know that I have a good interpretation of internal validity
I understand it more in the
for
context of research than,
the measurement
yeah.
view. Aside from, I mean, the closest thing I could think of in making that connection is whether this inference is supported by the evidence or not, right? And reliability can play a role in that. So I think if you wanted to draw that line, that's how I would try to draw it.
Okay.
Other thoughts about it? You don't have to agree with me.
I don't, yeah, thinking about like internal and external validity in terms of how we talk about it in research methods, I think for me it always has to do with kind of the controls and generalizability of what we're talking about due to how we've designed our study. But I don't feel like we talk about internal and external validity in terms of measurement. We have validity, and then we have kind of the types and doing a validity argument. So the way we talk about validity in measurement versus research methods is very different in that we have kind of the validity argument and measurement versus the internal-external distinctions and kind of balancing between those controls and the generalizability kind of in the research methods realm.
Yeah, so with the way that I think measurement people talk about it might be internal structure, right? Which is pretty much the factor structure. So does the pattern, if we expect there to be, if I wrote some depression items that's supposed to tap into these different aspects of depression, would I expect those to be different factors or not? And looking at the pattern of correlations that you get to try to make sense out of those things was how most people think of internal structure. External in that sense would be looking at how that stuff connects to the broader, other measures, other criteria and so forth. I think my mind just went blank, but the person who...
Benson.
That's right. Yeah, so I think the way that Benson thinks about that, she kind of divides up the process of validation by looking through these types of steps where you look at internal structure, prior to looking at external things. And I think because the overlap in language between internal structure and then looking at external things, and then internal validity and experimental design and external validity, it creates a lot of confusion for people, because we have a very specific way, like its internal structure is what most people are thinking about, and is that aligned with internal validity? They're not exactly the same thing, really. I mean, I guess you could look at process models with respect to what's creating internal structure, right? So those arrows, and like a CFA or EFA, or those arrows, do we have evidence that those arrows are causally kind of working in some way? Should we think of it in terms of causation or not, right? So you might look at more processes and so forth to try to get at something that experimental psychologists would view as internal validity. You know what I mean? But that leads to a lot of, I think the use of language there has led to a lot of confusion. Or it's easy to not kind of separate those in your mind. That was kind of a tangent, I suppose. All right. Okay. No more questions or thoughts about internal structure, those things. Okay. Take-home message, right? Some of the take-home messages. Not panacea. I hope that's obvious through the readings and so forth, that it's not a cure. Does anyone know the story of the Greek goddess? No? I will do my best to remember some of it, right? But basically she was a goddess who had like, she used some type of, if anyone knows, please correct me, because it's been a while since I looked up the story. But she basically had some type of medicinal water or something, and this would cure whatever the person had, right? So it didn't really matter what type of illness they had, but there was one remedy that would cure everything. And that's basically how that use of the word. I don't know why she was named Panacea. I'm sure there's some, like you could look at the etymology or something of it to get at that. But kind of interesting tidbits. Can PA meet the same standards? And the answer is, I would be concerned if it couldn't do that. So I think that it should meet the same standards that we would expect of any other test, right? Obviously, I think people now, those articles that we looked at are old, right? That debate was happening in the 1990s, and then we read an article from 1951, or a chapter from 1951, right? What do people think now, right? Very few people would say, oh, PAs or performance assessments are bad. We should all stick with multiple choice tests, or performance assessments, that's the answer to everything. I think most people would be more cautious about that. And what we see now is many people are trying to do this in a way that we can meet certain standards. So there's a lot of, I think people are interested in it, they want to do it, but doing it well is not easily, that's not done very easily. It's very hard, I think. And oftentimes people jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, let's just do a performance assessment, not knowing how difficult that really can be and how resource intensive that is. That's one thing we're facing with Cluster 2 right now. We're doing performance assessments to look at general education and the arts and humanities, and that's very resource intensive. Faculty need to be there. Eventually we're going to develop scoring procedures. It takes time to develop a rubric. We don't know that the rubric is going to work exactly right yet. So I mean, it's very intense. How do you do that on a large scale and still give them the type of data that they want? Well, that's very challenging. Even in Cluster 1 with the critical thinking test, it's very resource intensive to train people and score those things. And you can only get by with scoring so many of them. So how do we do this? Maybe we could just use automated scoring, right? Okay, so many of you submitted questions, right? Are there questions that, I do have those questions, if you're interested, but I think we're getting close. Yeah, we're done. So I don't want to keep you longer than what we have said because I know our calendars are busy. So I am going to start to incorporate those next, time. And some of the questions we've already hit on, obviously. So next week you're going to read the NILOA article, and then an article that I recently published that actually, I'm going to change this now because it just came out today in Research in Higher Education that's looking at the same things that these people in NILOA are kind of debating. So read both of those. Then we're going to basically look and spend some time thinking about whether we believe that these red herrings, are they really red herrings? What's the argument against it? Do we buy that or not? And get into more some of the policy stuff before we move on to other things. So, like I said, most of this course, various things are going to be controversial, and that's just something you can't run away from with a topic like this. So, okay, other than that, I think That's it.
You let us know about your room next week.
Oh, yes, I will. I will check on changing the room to the bigger room. That way we're not cramped in here, and I imagine if we add 1 or 2 more, it would just get kind of out of hand really quick, so. Okay. Wait. This.